All right, history buffs, and a special shout out to everyone in Mr. A's world history class. Got that big Unit 4 review on your mind? Feeling like maybe there are just a million dates, names, and ideas kind of swirling around?
Yeah, it can definitely feel overwhelming.
Well, let's try and clear that mental whiteboard today. We're doing a deep dive, and we've specifically tailored this one to help you tackle, the really complex world of 19th and early 20th century imperialism in Asia.
That's exactly right. Our mission today is, well, basically to be your ultimate study guide, cutting through all that information. We're going to try and untangle the very different experiences of China, Japan, and India. And, importantly, we'll directly tackle those central historical questions you've been working on in class. Connect the dots, see the bigger picture.
And hopefully ace that review.
That's the plan.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with China. I mean, China arguably faced some of the most, intense and, frankly, aggressive imperial pressures. When we look at Western involvement there, particularly in the 19th century, how do we even start to figure out if it was like a legitimate pursuit of trade or something much more exploitative? Because trade itself, it sounds pretty harmless on the surface, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And that's exactly where you need to dig a little deeper. When you pull back the curtain on, say, the Opium Wars, what looks like maybe just simple economics gets much, much darker. Britain had this huge demand for Chinese goods, silk, ceramics, tea.
This is stuff everyone wanted back home.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hugely popular. But the problem was China, well, they didn't really want much that Britain was selling. So you get this massive trade imbalance. Silver is just pouring out of Britain to pay for all these Chinese luxuries.
Right, because China was pretty self-sufficient. They didn't need British stuff, so the silver flow was just one way. Was there really no other way for Britain to balance things out? Did it have to be opium?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Britain's solution to this trade deficit was opium. The British East India Company, which was just this absolute economic giant, realized they could make enormous profits smuggling opium from India into China. Just to give you a sense of the scale, we're talking a business valued at nearly £1 million back in 1831. That's, over 100 million pounds today?
Wow, just from smuggling opium.
Just from that illicit trade. So, yeah, while Britain might frame it as a trade solution.
Yeah, no, definitely didn't see it that way.
Not at all. They saw it clearly for what it was. A destructive poison, not legitimate trade. We have that incredibly powerful letter, from the PM official Lin Zexu to Queen Victoria in 1839. He doesn't mince words. He calls opium poison, talks about the devastating effects, people getting sickly, unproductive. They even had the death penalty for using or selling it.
Yeah.
Lin Zexu demanded, and this is a direct quote basically, absolute annihilation for the foreign suppliers.
Talk about drawing a line in the sand. And they acted on it too, right? In 1839, Qing officials seized and destroyed something like 20,000 chests, which is
about 1,400 tons of opium. Yeah. A huge amount. And they banned British merchants. The message was crystal clear.
But Britain didn't exactly take it lying down.
No. Their response was fast and, aggressive. They started talking about right to free trade, accused China of violating, international trading principles. And crucially, they had superior weapons. Yeah. Especially their navy. They pretty easily defeated China in what became the First Opium War.
And the result, the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, was just a massive win for Britain, no question. British subjects could live and trade freely in certain cities like Canton. China had to pay millions for the destroyed opium.
$6 million, yeah. A huge sum then.
And maybe most importantly, they abolished the Kuhong system. So China couldn't restrict who British merchants traded with anymore.
Exactly. And that treaty, it really damaged the Qing dynasty's prestige. It created deeper divisions inside China, which is a really critical point for Mr. A's class to grasp.
Definitely. And then, of course, other powers started sniffing around.
The United States, looking over at China, got worried. They feared a kind of scramble for Africa situation happening there, and they wanted their piece of the action before it was too late. This leads to John Hay's open door notes. The idea was basically that China should be open to trade with all countries, so no single power could monopolize it.
Okay, but this brings us right back to that first question, doesn't it? Was this open door policy genuinely anti-imperialist? Or was it just a different flavor of imperialism, a way for the U.S. to elbow its way in? You even see those political cartoons, right? The U.S. literally forcing the door open with the U.S. Army and Navy presence propping it.
It really does challenge that idea of legitimate trade, yeah. It's a classic case where anti-monopolies can still serve imperial ambitions, just shared ones. And this whole situation, this pressure, it sets up our next big question about China perfectly.
Which is?
How did China's attempts to resist all this Western imperialism ultimately help bring down the Qing dynasty and fuel the rise of Chinese nationalism?
Right, and this is where the Boxer Rebellion comes in. Who exactly were these Boxers?
They were members of a secret society, the Order of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. Intensely anti-Christian, anti-foreign. Their resentment had been building for years. They basically believed foreigners were colonizing China, especially after all those humiliating wars with Western powers.
And they even blamed things like floods on Western influence?
Yeah, there was this belief that disrupting the natural order, angering spirits, it was all tied to foreign presence and technologies like railways or telegraphs. It was a real boiling point.
We have accounts from people who lived through it, right?
Yeah, we do. Fei Qihao, who was a Chinese Christian, wrote about it. He described the Boxers as, fiercely loyal to their country nationalists, really, in their own way, but also responsible for killing hundreds during this time of chaos. There were stories, allegations about foreigners poisoning wells. It just fueled the fire.
And how did it end?
Ultimately, a multinational force, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and the U.S., marched on Beijing and put down the rebellion pretty brutally. The consequences for China were severe. Huge reparations, like $330 million, and they were banned from importing firearms.
So the rebellion failed, but what was the bigger impact for China's path forward?
Even though it was crushed, the Boxer Rebellion was absolutely pivotal. It starkly highlighted the Qing dynasty's weakness, its inability to protect China. This really contributed to its final collapse in 1911. And maybe even more importantly, it directly fueled the rise of a powerful, modern Chinese nationalism. A nationalism focused squarely on getting rid of foreign influence and imperial control.
A powerful response, born from resistance, even in defeat.
Absolutely. That idea of nationalism, forged in that fire, is what reshaped China's entire future. It wasn't just about kicking foreigners out. It was about reimagining China itself. A huge takeaway for your class.
Okay, so from China's intense struggle, let's pivot now to Japan. Their path was, well, remarkably different when faced with Western imperialism. So our core question for Japan is, how did Japan's strategic adaptation to these Western demands lead to its rapid transformation? From being isolated to becoming this powerful, industrialized, even imperialist state itself. It's such a contrast.
It really is. Japan's story starts with deep isolation. From the 1600s onwards, they basically shut the doors to the world. Sakoku, the closed country policy. And they actually did pretty well during this time. Significant economic growth, internal peace. Technologically, compared to the West, they were behind. No real industrial capacity.
And the West, always looking for new markets and resources.
Saw Japan as this untapped prize. And it was the U.S., really, that forced the issue in the mid-1800s. Commodore Matthew Perry's fleet.
The famous black ships.
Exactly. With, as you said, the guns of the U.S. Navy making a very clear point. They pressured Japan into signing the Treaty of Kanagawa. Japan really had very little choice but to start foreign relations.
They were kind of backed into a corner.
Completely. But here's what's fascinating. This moment was a massive wake-up call. And some Japanese leaders grasped the implications incredibly quickly. There's this figure, Ii Naosuke, a powerful daimyo. Even before the treaty in 1853, he laid out this really striking vision. He suggested Japan should hire Dutch experts, right? To learn about large guns, handling ships, navigation.
Okay, learning from the West.
But here's the key part he mentioned. The secret purpose was to train a Japanese navy strong enough to sail the oceans freely, so they wouldn't have to rely on anyone else.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't just passive acceptance. It was like, okay, we have to deal with this, but let's learn their game so we can eventually play it ourselves.
Precisely. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about turning the situation to their advantage. Strategic pragmatism. Almost a cold calculation.
That's incredible foresight under pressure.
And it leads directly into the Meiji Restoration. This was a huge political upheaval. The Tokugawa shogunate, the military government, was overthrown. Emperor Matsuhito came back to power, ruled from 1867 to 1912. They dismantled feudalism, stripped the daimyo of their power and land. A massive change.
And this whole era was about modernization, but you mentioned a paradox.
Yeah, it's interesting. They created a new constitution in 1889. On paper, it looked like a democracy. But in reality, power stayed with this small group, the ruling oligarchy, the Sacho leaders. So authoritarianism continued. It was called a restoration of the emperor's power, but it's also a total revolution for Japan's future. Rapid top-down modernization.
Why did they push so hard so fast?
Because the leaders, even those who initially distrusted the West, realized Japan had to modernize to survive, to avoid ending up like China, carved up by foreign powers. It was adapt or perish, basically.
And adapt they did. More than adapt, they thrived. Japan industrialized incredibly quickly. And then, maybe the most surprising part, they became an imperialist power themselves. Why?
Well, several reasons. Lack of space, lack of natural resources on the islands, desire for wealth. They looked around and saw how Western countries got rich. Colonies. Colonies meant cheap labor, raw materials, and captive markets for manufactured goods. They learned the lesson of imperialism all too well.
And decided to apply it.
Exactly. And they proved they could. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905, Japan versus Russia, fighting over control of Manchuria.
And Japan won against a major European power.
Won easily. Humiliated Russia. This was a massive shock globally. For centuries, European powers had this assumption of their own racial and technological superiority, that it was the natural order. Japan's victory just shattered that. It showed the world that a non-Western nation could industrialize, modernize its military, and beat a major European power. It completely changed the geopolitical game.
That's a huge point for your class. The psychological impact of that victory must have been immense, proving adaptation could lead to power, not just submission.
Absolutely. A stark contrast to China's experience during the same period.
Okay, so we've seen China's struggle and Japan's adaptation. Let's turn now to India, a place that experienced British imperialism maybe more directly and for longer than almost anywhere else. Our final central question here is, to what extent was British rule in India primarily exploitative, and how did that exploitation actually spark the demand for self-rule?
Right. The story in India really starts, again, with the British East India Company, the BEIC. This wasn't the British government initially, it was a corporation. Queen Elizabeth there granted it an exclusive charter, basically monopoly on trade with the East. Way back in 1600, it was the first big joint stock corporation. And its investors got incredibly wealthy, from Indian goods, tea, cotton, spices.
But like we saw, the BEIC wasn't just about trade for long, was it?
No. It rapidly expanded its power. It even maintained its own private army. At its peak, maybe 260,000 soldiers, mostly Indians.
Wow, a private army that large.
Yeah. And then comes the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Robert Clive, a key BAIC figure, made a secret deal, won the battle, and the company gained huge taxation powers in Bengal. That was a massive shift. Profits weren't just from trade anymore. They were from taxing the Indian population directly. A huge power grab.
And we already mentioned their role in the opium trade.
Right. Growing opium in India, smuggling it into China to pay for tea, ignoring China's ban, enriching BAIC investors while causing immense suffering in China. It shows the moral flexibility, let's say. They even used Indian soldiers, the sepoys, not just for fighting, but to administer territory and make sure those taxes got collected.
So it's really no surprise India became known as the jewel in the British crown. It was just so profitable and strategically important for Britain.
Hugely. There may be three key reasons we can point to. First, just a sheer abundance of natural resources in its prime location. India provided raw materials. Cotton, for example, was absolutely vital for Britain's industrial revolution and massive tax revenues.
Okay, resources and money. What else?
Second, India's enormous population became a captive market for British manufactured goods. They were forced to buy clothing made in British factories. And this systematically destroyed India's own, centuries-old, handmade textile industry. Wiped it out.
Devastating.
And third, its strategic position.
Right.
Between England and China. Perfect for the silk trade. And it allowed Britain to set up military posts to protect all their trade interests in the Far East. So yeah, economically, strategically, it was the jewel.
But all this exploitation, it must have created enormous resentment, which leads us to the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857.
Exactly. The causes were complex, building over time. The increasing presence of Christian missionaries made many Indians fear forced conversion. But the flashpoint, the thing that really set it off, was the introduction of new rifle cartridges. These cartridges were rumored to be greased with pig and beef fat.
Which would be deeply offensive to both Muslim and Hindu sepoys.
Deeply offensive. And many British officers were just seen as completely insensitive to Indian culture and religious beliefs. It was the final straw for many sepoys.
So they refused to use the cartridges.
They refused.
Yeah.
And it sparked widespread violence. The rebellion, or mutiny, lasted over a year. It was incredibly bloody on both sides. In the end, the British government stepped in, dissolved the East India Company, and took direct control of India.
And the interpretation of this event is still debated, right?
Yeah.
Mutiny, rebellion, First War of Independence.
Absolutely. And that itself is significant for your class. How you name it reflects your perspective. Someone like Mangal Pandey, who fired the first shot, Was he a mutinous soldier, as the British saw him, or a hero, a freedom fighter, as many in India view him? It highlights that clash of perspectives.
So after 1857, India comes under direct rule, the British Raj. How did that change things?
Well, now policy was directed from London by a cabinet minister. A British governor-general, the viceroy, carried out orders in India. In many ways, it meant even less local control than under the BEIC. It felt more direct, more foreign.
And the economic exploitation continued.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
If anything, it became more systematic. Policies were designed to force India to produce raw materials for British factories and then buy back the finished British goods. Indian competition was actively prohibited. That handloom textile industry we mentioned, it was decimated under the Raj.
And socially.
Socially, Indians were treated as second-class citizens in their own country, barred from top government jobs, paid far less than Europeans for the same work. A British engineer might earn many times more than an equally qualified Indian engineer.
So how does this all connect back to our question about self-rule?
Well, this growing discontent, this constant economic drain, the social discrimination, it directly fueled the rise of nationalist movements. Groups like the Indian National Congress, formed in 1885, and the Muslim League in 1906. Initially, they might have focused on specific grievances like access to jobs or representation, but the underlying current of resentment against British rule was always there. And by the early 1900s, these groups were explicitly calling for self-government, for Swaraj. So the exploitation didn't just cause hardship, it was the very catalyst for the demand for self-rule. It lit the fire.
That's a really clear connection. Exploitation breeding the desire for freedom.
And what's fascinating, stepping back, is looking at these three paths side by side. China's struggle leading to collapse and then this fierce nationalism. Japan's strategic adaptation, becoming an imperial power itself. And India's long exploitation under direct rule, eventually sparking its own massive independence movement. They really reveal so much about power, about resistance, about modernization, and how unpredictable the results of global expansion can be.
Absolutely. The choices made or the choices they were forced into just profoundly shaped their futures. China fights, loses, implodes, then rebuilds with this new national identity. Japan sees the threat, learns the game, and becomes a major player. India endures, and that endurance forges a unity that eventually throws off the rulers. Each path is just a unique, vital lesson for Mr. A's world history class.
So, as you're reviewing all this, really think about what these different outcomes tell us. How do nations respond when faced with overwhelming power? Is it always best to resist directly? Or to adapt strategically? Or does it just depend entirely on the specific circumstances, the leadership, the timing? Consider how these central historical questions you're studying aren't just about events long ago. They offer really critical ways to think about global discussions happening right now about power, sovereignty, economic development, and national identity.
They really do. The echoes are definitely still felt today. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. Until next time, keep digging into history.